I was using those financial tools going into it to look at the analysis, but I lacked the pragmatic experience to poke at my assumptions. And so it's really that mix of operational experience versus how to put it in a spreadsheet. I can model anything, but garbage in, garbage out. If the assumptions are crap, it's not going to help your business.
And welcome to the Gross Profit Podcast. My name is James Kennedy. I'm the CEO and co-founder at procurementexpress.com. We take the hassle out of managing your company's purchasing with magical features, but we're not here to talk about that today. Instead, I've invited along Ben de la Cretaz from TechCXO. Ben is I'm going to say longtime customer at Procurement Express now, and he has a very unconventional background when it comes to working as a fractional CFO. And I think this would be beneficial for you to listen to if you're trying to figure out what your dream business would be. Because Ben, to a certain extent, is a lot closer to his dream business today, working with clients. But he got there in a rather interesting path, not a traditional path. So Ben, thanks very much for coming along. Maybe you could just give us a bit of a background, introduce yourself, tell us where you are in the world.
Thanks, James. Happy to be here. I am based in Boston, Massachusetts. I've been in Boston for about the past 20 years. I currently am a partner with my firm called TechCXO, which is based out of Atlanta. We've been running for over 20 years, and we work with startups and growth stage companies. In Boston, we've got a smaller pod, maybe about 10 or 15 partners. And my functional areas are primarily working with life sciences and med device companies, takes up about half of my client base. But then just being with the incredible educational institutions we've got in the greater Boston area, you see so much very interesting IP coming out of MIT, Harvard, Northeastern. And there's a lot of startups coming out with that. And so I work with small teams of very smart founders who may have never been in business before, getting into their first real job in their mid-30s after, a life of academia. And so I work with them to help bring the technology that they're working on through R&D stages and to market, and hopefully help them get what they're looking for to be realized.
So how do you explain all that to your kids?
Well, the short answer is I usually give up. But the way I explain it generally is that my kids have run a lemonade stand for a few years at a neighborhood yard sale. And I tell them, other folks that have businesses, I help them understand how the money works in their business, and I help them grow their business. That's usually about as far as I'm able to get.
Going into business, was that always the name of the game for you? What made you interested in business in the first place?
The short answer is no. I went to a undergrad. I started with the notion that I was going to be pre-med, ended up majoring in Russian lit. So something completely impractical and unmarketable. But in the late 90s, that was where there was still a lot of excitement about the potential for what Russia was going to open up and become. What ended up happening in college that I used for my professional career is that I ended up DJing. And we like to throw some desert parties. We threw some events on college in campus. And I decided, I've got no idea what I'm looking to do, but I like putting on events. I like seeing crowds of people enjoying themselves. And so I decided to go into restaurants and make that happen. And out of college, I gave myself a 5-year goal to open up a restaurant within 5 years. I think I kind of forgot about it about a year later. But I was, working just bartending, waiting tables, managing restaurants for a couple years. I decided to go get my MBA to further that dream. I got my MBA for entrepreneurship rather than doing anything for hospitality. Because even in my hubristic and naive early 20s, I still kind of had this notion that after the first line of any business becomes much more about business than the specialty of the business. And so I thought having something more focused on the entrepreneurial aspect rather than the hospitality aspect would benefit me greater in the long run. Having a fellowship at Babson for entrepreneurship, it was a full-time program, great experience, but all of these concepts were new to me. There were my classmates that were, economics undergrads or accounting undergrads, and I was or had professional experience, and really I had none. But that ends up kind of being a common theme of approaching things with unencumbered by traditional experience. So that I would like to think helps my approach to be a little bit more creative and non-traditional, which at the front end of that journey, I never would have considered to be an asset. But looking back over the past 20 years, I think it definitely has been.
If you were to go back again today, would you still do the MBA? And why do you still think it's worthwhile to?
100%. I think where I got my MBA, it had been focused on entrepreneurship for, God, when I went in 05, I believe there were banners around saying #1 in entrepreneurship for 25 years. It had this focus on entrepreneurial thinking. They said, this is for startups, but it can also be entrepreneurial thinking in more established companies. How can you bring this type of thinking into companies that have already been institutionalized? Coming from a non-traditional background, that type of speech appealed to me. It was also kind of where I got first into diving into mechanics of any of these platforms, diving into financial modeling. And it was something that I ended up having a knack for. And it was something that I like to nerd out on, and I had fun. The interesting thing, exactly to your question, would I have done it again? I bought and started a business, actually second year of my MBA. I bought the business and we launched it right after I graduated. I really didn't use any of the tools from my MBA for the 4 years where I was running the business. I was the only person at top, and I was like, I'm looking at the bank statements. I'm not doing any of this analysis. And it wasn't until after I moved on from my business that I kind of revisited those tools and had a little bit more time and space and say, oh, geez, I would have applied them in this way. And then I was able to take those lessons and apply them to other people's businesses.
At least having it on your CV must have helped. And how did you fund the acquisition of the business?
It helped directly in the fact that I had, the first year for MBA was a bunch of standard courses. But the second year, you got to pick electives and pick 2 different courses that were hugely influential, buying a small business and M&A for entrepreneurs. And walked through the entire process with business brokers. And we actually reached out to real businesses for sale and tried to do that dance with brokers to kind of understand it, always hiding the fact that we were just students. But it was very interesting. And then that guided the whole process. And the professor there it was a great sounding board as we were looking at venues to buy and how to negotiate the deal and go with that. The funding of it, I had, a small amount of seed money on my own, but largely it was from the SBA, the Small Business Administration in the States. And I think I got the last loan for a restaurant entertainment venue before the 07-08 crisis. So that I was able to sneak that in there to head for operations.
Really need to have some angle to make hospitality work. It's incredibly competitive. Everyone thinks they can do it. Those businesses are starting up and going out of business all the time. What was your vision for what would make you guys survive and thrive?
I hate to admit it, but I was 25. I thought anything I touched would just work out. And I remember having that conversation once with someone that I was working within the businesses. I just don't think we're going to fail. And I was like, that's just not what I do. And looking back on it now, I mean, I shudder to say that out loud, and it's just so embarrassing. The thought not only coming into my head, but thinking that it was reasonable enough to say out loud. The angle was it was a restaurant, lounge, entertainment venue. It had an all entertainment license, about 40 or 50 seats inside, 30-seat patio, DJ, bands, and it was a period in the Boston area where there was a great culture of independent restaurants, and so we just kind of wanted to play in that mix. The ultimate goal of it was not a single venue, but to have multiple independently themed independent restaurants, but was sort of a central back office because these smaller businesses still have to do all the admin work. But if you only have one location, that's a lot of overhead for a single location. So the little bit the MBA was contributing to that was for economies of scale for the overhead, but never ended up getting beyond a single location. So I wasn't able to realize that.
I mean, I hear many, many successful people saying that, if I'd known how hard it would have been, I never would have started. So you had that sort of optimism. I think you need to do that.
It's interesting because that experience, you know, made me who I am today, personally, professionally. And so I'm grateful for it. At the same time, had I, at the beginning of it, had any inclination of what I was getting into, I never would have done it. And so it's this weird relationship with my past there of that delusion and risk taking. It didn't work out for that venture, but it worked out overall. And so trying to reconcile the past with the present in that regard, it's keeping two truths together at the same time.
And did you launch it by yourself or did you have a business partner?
I launched it with a business partner, and we had actually been talking about three of us for a bit. Ended up coming down to two. I was ended up being the only owner in the business, but we did launch it together. And being the only owner obviously has different implications. I'm not gonna get into the details too much, but the business relationship didn't work out. After a year, we had to part ways, and it ended poorly.
Well, listen, I'll do you a deal. I'll tell you why my business partnership didn't work out, and then maybe you can tell me if you maybe no worry, no one's listening. It's fine. So you don't know Rich. He's my current business partner, but there was another guy, Jer. Jer, we started off the three of us. So Jer was writing the code. Rich was looking good. I don't know what he's doing. I'll have to check with him. He does the sales now anyway. So if you do a demo, you'll meet Rich. And I was supposed to sell the thing. And Jer did a really good job. He wrote the first version of Procurement Express. It's still, the bones of what he did are still in there somewhere. And he delivered his end within about 4 weeks. And my job was to go sell the thing. And I said, listen, give me 2 months, I'll be selling it. So, week 4, 5, 6, 7, 10, 12, 16 came and went with no sales. And after a while, Jared started to look sideways at us, going, well, I don't know, guys. You said you'd be able to sell it, and not a lot is happening. So we launched in April with UNICEF, who was our first pre-sale customer, but the idea was to try and get another one. And then in August, someone from Nigeria rang us up wanting to buy the software and gave us the credit card. And I rang Rich to say, hey, this guy from Nigeria wants to buy our software. And he says, oh, that's great. Have you got his credit card? Yeah. And then he said, did you give him our credit card? I said, no. He says, well, okay, well, let's try and charge it and see if it works. So that was for like $100 a month. Jared decided, no, you guys, you clearly, I'm a programmer. I can get 10 grand a month. I'm out of here. So he left. And the week after he left, we landed our biggest ever customers, Holloman Corporation. God bless you, Holloman. They're still out there in Texas. But the reason it didn't work out was just a lack of faith, because it takes always twice as long as you think, or 10 times as long maybe as you think it's going to take. Jared, maybe he had options. Maybe it was the difference, because he was a very well-paid programmer. He could go get other jobs. I just had a kid. I had no other option. The second choice was go work for someone else. And that's why we broke up. So looking back on it, why do you think it didn't work out with your partner?
Now I'm giving it a little bit more thought of how to communicate this. It actually ties more into where I'm at now. The business partner I started with, he had more experience in the industry, and frankly, he was a better operator than I was. However, he didn't have the same financial literacy. And being the only owner, I'm worried about cash and how we're going to continue to operate. And there was one conversation I remember specifically where our costs on a certain thing were too high and we were losing money on every month, and he was looking to create an incentive structure for an employee to get these costs down. I'm like, okay, I like that in theory, but where's the cash going to come from? And it was like, well, the cash is going to come from the savings. I was like, but we're not actually accumulating more cash. We're just losing a little bit less. There was this disconnect of just how cash worked. So, not being on the same page from a financials perspective made it very difficult to operate. Now that I'm hearing myself speak has been sort of a seed and a lesson throughout my entire career, as really kind of informed why I do what I do. It's to be able to communicate to founders and executive teams how the cash works in their business. That was a lesson for me, that I've kept to this day.
Like if I think of my early businesses, if I think back them now, like there was no financial way they could ever have worked. And yet I spent so much time on it. Like I used to sell text messages in the back of magazines. It was crazy. There was no way I could ever pay for anything. But I still worked on it. And somehow I wasn't able to get past myself. I was so enamored with the idea. I couldn't see, no, this ladder is clearly against the wrong wall. And you need someone to be able to tell you which ladder the wall is against. And because that's what you're going to get.
I mean, you kind of just described the CFO job right there. Is is what the role is. I think the interesting thing is that I was using those financial tools going into it to look at the analysis, but I lacked the pragmatic experience to poke at my assumptions. And so it's really that mix of operational experience versus how to put it in a spreadsheet. I can model anything, but if the garbage in, garbage out, if the assumptions are crap, it's not going to help your business. That's what I hope I do now, is pull together lots of assumptions from the team, create an output that can help guide strategic decisions and inform it, but simultaneously say, I think these assumptions are crap and this is what I'm looking at.
But you're not sitting in a hotel lobby now in a chain of restaurants, so something happened.
The partnership itself, it ended about a year. After a year, it ended poorly, and we continued to run it. I had to fire about half the staff. That there was a little bit of a schism. Some took it well, others did not. But we ran it for another solid 3 to 4 years, and it had crowds and it was popular, but it was never throwing off the cash that it needed to move on to other ventures. I always kind of say, looking back on it, if I had known everything at the beginning of the experience that I did at the end, I could have made it a much more successful venture. There were just a lot of very expensive first-time learning experiences. That was really my real MBA, if you want to call it. It got to a point where I realized, hey, I can run this out another 6 years on the lease, and then restart my life, or I can just decide to move on now and restart. And figured I'd rather do that in my early 30s than my late 30s. And so after I closed that and moved on to the next stage, really I had no idea where I was going to go with that. My MBA was a little bit stale, and again, it was a fall. I had my dream of running the place that I wanted, and ended up going back to bartending afterwards. And that was a big hit to the ego. But then working in those restaurants, they were all facing the same problems. They were all struggling. And so I kind of worked my way into the office and looking at the numbers and trying to say, hey, let me help you look at your business. And I realized that not only did I have a knack for it, but it was a lot easier to do when it was someone else's business than when I was the one having to make payroll and pay the rent. And so I could look at the numbers. The numbers wouldn't necessarily look good, but I could also leave the numbers at work and it wouldn't affect my sleep. And so that was sort of the balance where I was bringing in my own experience and my own skill set, but then it wasn't as personally taxing to me, and it was also providing relief to some of the operators for whom it was personally emotionally taxing, because it's not fun running a business that isn't throwing off the cash that you need to pay for the business. I found myself working in that field and really liking it. I did for about a year in that mix. I went on to hospitality in something corporate for a year, working with a multinational hospitality company, thinking, okay, maybe the startup life isn't for me. Maybe I climbed the corporate ladder. And after about, I don't know, 6 months, I realized, nope, not climbing the corporate ladder. and, and started throwing out as many resumes as I could. And I ended up connecting with this unique group of folks. They were looking for an MBA with a passion for the hospitality industry and a background in entrepreneurship and willingness to take a very low salary. And I was thinking, geez, the Venn diagram of people that fit in there is like of one. So I'm okay. I think I might actually have a shot. But it was a really interesting group of people, a bunch of I'd say a bunch of PwC consultants that were kind of looking to do, I guess, I don't want to dismiss it. It was sort of described as a legacy project. They had built their own professional careers and they wanted to do something that had a more impact for the community. And so we built a food tech incubator, and there was a small investment fund. I got on board before any of this was launched. I became the director of finance of the investment fund, the incubator, and then they launched a little bit later their own line of business. And they were always looking at projects. And that was really where I got that, continued that passion of working with small businesses, but then also connected to some more high growth focused companies. My background at that point was small business. And so I wanted to help these small business operators with some of the lessons I had learned. The interesting thing was I learned those operators, they didn't really want any of the coaching. They just wanted someone else to do all of their financial work. And, that wasn't my job. That wasn't what I was there for. It was like, well, I can connect you with the people that will do that. I really wanted to work with them and sort of educate them on the finances of their own business and what the important things were to focus on. This was back in 2014 or so, where you're starting to see some money being put into prepared meal delivery services, meal kits, and this is some VC money going in here. That the folks focused on that had more your traditional VC fundraising, starting with friends and family, then maybe getting some institutional, looking at convertible rounds, hoping to get to a Series A, looking at different growth models. They were very interested in having a strategic financial partner that could help them look at the business, help them model scenarios, look at cash needs. And then one of those companies that I was doing some work with had an advisor that was with my current firm. And I'd never heard of fractional CFO work. I don't even think I'd even heard of the term fractional. But I was working with that partner with this one company, and he kind of pulled me aside and was saying, well, these folks, I don't think they're going anywhere, but what are you doing? And I told him why I was kind of working with them and what my interests were, and said, well, I've got a couple other projects. Maybe why don't we pull you on here? And it just exposed me into an entirely new world of tech and high growth startups, and my own skill set and my own experience lended itself well enough to provide some service for these startups. And I harassed him until he connected me with the managing partner of the Boston office, who, after a while reluctantly gave me a fractional director gig with a company that is actually a VR cycling company that I'm still working with today, 8 years later. That was exciting. I didn't blow things up. So I was able to continue to harass him until he said, okay, fine, I'll give you another one. And this was in life sciences. And I got to work with him on that life sciences client as well. And with those two, that was enough for me to be able to jump ship. And I was doing this on the side, and I was able to jump ship and become a full-time consultant for my current firm.
I was part of a PwC program as well that was very generous with their time, very high level, expensive consultants who were spending time with us. But I always felt like it never really, something was missing in the connection there. Like the aspiration was there, but then the skill set they were bringing was totally different to getting your first, second, third customer.
I know it's kind of cliche at this point, but there's a grit and resilience component to it. And I think, my own experience running a restaurant lounge for 4 years where, my dishwashers were getting paid more than me and working 14 to 20-hour days, and sometimes coming in, the only time I can paint or redo the bathroom is after we close at 2 a.m. and before the cooks have to start getting there at 8. That personal experience of knowing that you just have to do everything it takes, that's a tough lesson to learn when you've got a comfortable yet potentially unfulfilling professional corporate job. And that was actually one of the interesting things, at the incubator. I felt there was a large part of my job. There were people coming in looking to start businesses, either small business or startup, was frankly me talking them out of it. That they're coming in their, more middle of their career, late 30s, early 40s, saying, I've always had a passion for food. I really want to do this. My job isn't terribly exciting. My friends and family all say I should go and do this. So I want to look at this, but I've got to make at least this much a year. I need to get benefits because my spouse isn't working and has these issues and so on. And my general response to them was like, you need to get a hobby and read a book and maybe do some meditation. Like, don't blow it all up to do this. This is not where you're going to find fulfillment. But then on the other end, we had a lot of other folks that were coming into it being very pragmatic, knowing that they could risk it all and that it might not come out. And I remember one of them specifically, he was in his mid 20s. He bought a used food truck with a little bit of money from his uncle, ran it for 2 years. He had decent numbers, but not enough to do anything new. And then he decided to sell and move on. And in the sort of exit interview, he was saying, well, I probably lost about $30,000 or $40,000 over the past couple years, but I learned a hell of a lot. And frankly, if you compare that to 2 years of grad school, I think I probably learned a lot more. And I just remember being so impressed with the attitude coming out of it, of just looking at it in the right way, of he was going to have that experience with him for the rest of his life. And just like me, that's going to inform the way he looks at the world, both in his personal and professional lives.
It makes sense to me that funded startups, so these are startups not necessarily cash flowing yet, but are swinging from funding round to funding round. They need to be a lot more sophisticated.
Oh, they're definitely cash flowing, just only one way, in the wrong way.
Straight down, straight down.
It was an incredible experience. I ended up very closely working with two CFO partners on a number of different clients. And over those 4 years, 2016 to 2020, I said it before, I say it again, that those 4 years felt like 20 or 30 years of industry experience had I single threaded any of those positions. I don't tell any of my clients from this era that, but it was always sort of the question of, hey, can you do this? And I'm like, yeah, absolutely. And the CFO partners would say, hey, can you do this? Yeah, absolutely. And then thank God for Google, I'd just go over and like, how do you do this? I'm like, oh, okay, maybe. And I was able to figure it out well enough. But what I really appreciated over those years was the ability to iterate my operational approaches, iterate the systems that I used for these. Because what I found was that if I were working for a single company through their stages of growth, I'd encounter a single set of problems once, come up with a solution for it once. 6 months later, it would be a new set of growth challenges. And each time I'd come up with solutions, but each of those solutions might be an 80% solution because it's the first time I'm coming up with it. You look back on it and say, oh, this is what I do better. This is how I do it. But it's rarely worth it when you're putting in an operational system or putting in a way to look at the business to rip it all out, go back to zero, and put it back in to just get to 85%. So you usually end up kind of living with what you have. In this scenario, I was able to take that 80% solution. Okay, this is good. Learn from what I had, and then invariably 2 to 3 months later, client B would have the same problem. And I'd be like, aha, not only do I have the answer, but I've been waiting for how I can improve upon it to implement it. And it ended up being that each of the clients would sort of benefit from that cumulative experience. And as I did that, I got more efficient. I got more standardized in the tools and the skills that I would apply. We kind of internally we joke about it as company in a box, and being able to iterate on those solutions, being able to iterate on the messaging and the communication to boards and to executives, saying, from one conversation, this didn't quite land the way I wanted. I didn't quite get the message. This is how we shape it a little bit better so that I can get more efficient in the platforms and operations used to build the data, and then more efficient in taking the results of that data and communicating it to strategic teams. And I was only able to iterate that by working with multiple different clients in different yet sort of, they're all in their own industry, own stages of growth, but they were all sort of experiencing similar growing pains. And so that 4 years was hugely beneficial in that. And working with the two different CFO partners was very talented in what they do, very different approaches. It was great both from a nuts and bolts perspective of the mechanics required, but then also in a communications perspective. How do you get this message across to the CEO? How do you get this message across to the board member that doesn't want to hear it? And those were very important lessons.
So, what's the trickiest piece of information you had to deliver to a board member who didn't want to hear it?
First off, it all has to do with cash, but the revenue projections that we're saying, there's no way in hell we're going to meet them. It's great to have stretch goals, but hope for the best, plan for the worst. The second is really the reality of when that cash line crosses the x-axis, that we have to hit our milestones 3 to 6 months before we run out in order to do the next fundraising round. And if we're not on track to do that, there's got to be some hard decisions made. I will say, working with a variety of startup executives, they're incredible people to work with. They all kind of have their own special skill sets, special magic. But I think similar to me when I was opening up my business, no one gets into it unless they have a little bit of self delusion about what is and isn't possible. And so it's really finding that balance of, how do you keep the dream alive, and how do you figure out a plan that can get you there while also tempering some of the aspirations with reality.
When you have a greenfield site, which is nice, I guess, you have growing businesses going from around whatever ABC, and the teams are growing quickly. Unlike a lot of people, you don't put in an ERP straight away. You had a professor who gave you some advice back in the day.
Yeah, and this was before I even knew what an ERP was, but in grad school, I think the quote was, and he was re-quoting someone else, but was saying that putting in an ERP is like pouring concrete around your business operations. And I've learned this the hard way, relearned it as well with my companies, is just how fluid the operations and the goals are. You're always trying to balance real-time visibility into all of the numbers, and having as little work as possible go into seeing where you're at, because the more manual work there is, the A, more potential for error, and B, longer delay to actually see where you are. Balancing that with flexibility, knowing that in 3 months, this new line of business that you think is going to be 100%, this is where we're going, could be just totally shelved. And so if you put a lot of work, investment, capital into systems, into really firmly establishing that, and then you pivot, or then you switch focus, that can all be wasted. And it's not just the money, it's the time. And more than just the time and effort wasted, it's also that you're left with operational systems that don't support the current state of the business. So it can actually be a hindrance than if you kept it lighter and flexible, not in an ideal state, but at least flexible enough so that you can see where the business is at and work with the executive team to decide where to go. And there's a lot of software out there just off the shelf, relatively inexpensive SaaS that you can kind of assemble an ERP through their own API connections, through using Zapier, that's a little bit more familiar and flexible. And then when it is kind of running at that, okay, we have found what the business is about. We do know where the operations are. Now it is time to upgrade to a NetSuite or upgrade to an Acumatica. I've seen this too, where I've inherited legacy systems, ERPs, that were built for a different era of the business. And it's actually worse than if you were just running QuickBooks Online and a bunch of plugins, because you've built all this infrastructure around a business that essentially no longer exists.
What's the set of tools that you go in with? We know you use Procurement Express with some of your customers, and what's your go-to set for, let's say, biotech?
Really, almost 90% are on QuickBooks Online. You can push it out there. You can run a $100 million SaaS company on QuickBooks Online. So that's generally the foundation. It's easy to use, easy for people to plug in, easy for remote work, and cheap. Then beyond that, there's always, I've got my preferences, but I generally like to say I'm platform agnostic. Sometimes companies will come in with their own, and I'll use those. Other times, if it's greenfield, before it's QuickBooks Online, Bill.com, use a Brex or a Ramp for credit cards and banking and expense reimbursements. I try and keep the banking platforms. They all want to sell you their white label versions, but I view banking really as a commodity. And the more entrenched you get into any of their systems, which I find tend to not be very good, the harder it is for you to make strategic decisions with regard to banking, because then you have to pull out a bunch of your financial systems.
Which is the reason they give it to you in the first place, I guess.
Exactly. Yeah. No, I mean, it's a good business strategy, makes it sticky, but if we're getting venture debt from another company that requires us to bank with them, I don't want to say, well, we can't take that because our credit cards are with SVB. But then, I would say procurement has always kind of been, it's been a bit of a black hole. And it's one of those things where if you have it connected to your accounting, you really have to have someone managing it full time, because just with the purchasing, the receiving, if it's not done right, it can just create a mess in your accounting. And so I think that's when I first came across PEX. It was after a different platform implementation that was very shiny on the front and very thorough sales process. And then the implementation, and we were trying to connect it all. And it's always interesting when you go from sales to implementation. You get a whole different set of capabilities communicated to you, and realizing that, oh, well, actually, it doesn't work like that. So you need to structure your operations in a different way. I was like, no, I'm not going to structure my operations because of a platform. I'm I'm going to pick my platform because of the operations, and I want the platform to conform to the way we think about the business. And after that experience with a not cheap platform, then I kind of came across PEX just through the QuickBooks Online store, and seeing the reviews there. I'm like, okay, this works. And it was for a client that had their, typical startup doing purchasing in Google Sheets and sort of shared tracking POs that way. And it was like, well, we got to platform this. We got to have some approvals. But I intentionally kept it unhooked from accounting, mainly because I knew that, if procurement isn't kept exactly correct, it can make accounting worse. So I wanted to give the teams a directional sense of where they were on spend, at the front end of it rather than on the financial reporting. But I also didn't want to have a full-time staff accountant managing it, and it sort of worked great from that regard. But as the years have gone by and the company's needs have changed, the platform's capabilities have changed, we've actually switched that. So now that it is integrated and the workflow does go through PEX, we've cut out Bill.com because in some cases, because QuickBooks now can do its own internal payments. The fewer platforms people have to log in to approve, the better. And it just never works to say, oh, well, you have to go into this platform to approve POs and then get this other set of credentials to approve the invoice. So the more you can streamline it there, the easier it becomes. But the goal is the same. It's to have a flexible set of systems that gives you as close to real-time visibility into where we are spend to date with as little human management as possible. And so, setting up those systems to align with the approved budgets, setting up those systems to align with the way the business actually works, then, having someone either fractional on my team or a full-time finance employee on the company's team that is, managing that, but it doesn't require a full-time job. It's all about getting all of that financial information as fast as possible so that you can take that to do the real work, which is deciding, well, where do we go from here?
You've done something quite clever as well from a vendor perspective here. Like I knew your name long before we met, and the reason is that you have several clients with us, and from our perspective, even though each of those clients is very valued, but smaller end client, not necessarily a huge client, because they were managing through your relationship, they get a level of service that they probably wouldn't get if you were dealing with them individually or if they just came in and plugged in their credit card. So it's actually smart, and it makes me realize how we should be working with fractional CFOs in particular, is that, this is a way for fractional CFOs who have a number of relationships to deliver more value to their client because they're getting a higher level service than they would otherwise have access to, because you're having that group buying sort of on the other side.
There's a couple of things. There's definitely, platforms that I work with that multiple clients are on. Often they'll have like sort of incentive structures for resale. I never like to do that. It's a policy of our firm. If we get those, we always pass it back on to the client for those savings. But I do, and I'm shameless about this, of saying, well, if I'm bringing 5 clients to you, and if I'm introducing 5 other partners who are also each going to bring 5 clients to you, I want the best service possible, because my value to my clients is that I can get stuff done quickly. And so if I have platforms that help enable that, that makes me more valuable to the clients. Similarly, I think it's also, as you were saying that, I think it's a value to PEX as well, because frankly, I'm templatizing how we're using PEX, and I'm templatizing our ecosystem of systems so that it hopefully requires less onboarding work and support from PEX for each individual client, because I'm kind of taking my staff and rinse and repeat when we're doing another one. and B, requires less ongoing support. But when we do need some help, I love being able to just do chat or send an email to Nate and get a response right away. There's definitely platforms I've moved away from simply because I hate spending the first 20 minutes going through with a chatbot of trying to get to tier 2 support of yes. And then even when I get to that support, running through the things like I've already done and saying, yes, no, we've already done A, B, C, and D. It's like, this isn't a, have you tried turning it off and turning it back on again? Like we know the platform well. This is something new. And any platform is going to have struggles, but being able to get right there is just a huge value add for me personally and for my clients. And so beyond the platform itself, that's the second most important component of why I keep coming back to you.
You've opened my eyes to a whole strategy we should be doubling down on in Procurement Express. And largely, that's what this podcast is about. And that's why I'm focusing on, now my secret is out. Now you all know, but my secret out for doing all these podcasts. Listen, you've been a star. I'm going to wrap it up by asking the traditional question, which is, who's your business hero and why?
So I'm going to give a little bit of an evasive answer. It's not a single person that anyone's known with, but it's the joy of my job is I get to work with small teams of really smart people that are just looking to get stuff done, and with a low tolerance for BS, frankly. It's sort of that euphemistic, it's every person in every room. But no, it's these smart people that in small teams that are also very pragmatic, because operationalizing a dream or a vision, it takes pragmatism. And I always kind of think of my favorite quote. I think it was some military quote. Amateurs talk strategy and professionals talk logistics. Working with these teams, anyone can sit around at a meeting and argue about how many angels can fit on the head of a pin, but it takes a different type of skill set to say, well, this is our grand vision and this is our goal, but now we've got to roll up our sleeves and get it done. And the people that are doing that every day, those are the ones that are my heroes, and I like to exist in that world.
I think we're in a similar mindset there. Like actually just getting down to brass tacks, I can see why you're working with startups. So listen, if you're still listening to the podcast, thank you very much. I would love you to tell me what you think of the strategy we have for Procurement Express in focusing on fractional CFOs and figuring out how we can deliver a better service for them in particular. If you think it's dumb, you think it's great, leave a comment in the YouTubes here, and I'm guaranteed I'll get back to you, and I really appreciate it. Thank you very much for listening. And Ben, thank you for coming along today.
James, thank you for having me.